Hello everyone, thank you for joining. This is Rupa Datta. I'm at NSECE and the Project Director of the National Survey of Early Care and Education. We appreciate your joining our webinar today to talk about levels of geography in the NSECE and the analyses of those data. I'll start with a few logistics. We have muted all the participant phone lines, but we welcome your questions. You should have a chat box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and you can use that to select chat with the presenter and type your questions in. We will stop periodically throughout our session today to answer any questions that might have come in. Also, please feel free to use the chat feature if you're having any technical problems that we can try to help you with. So the main question for today is what geographic analyses are possible with the NSECE data? This is a question that we hear a lot, and geography was an important element of the design of the NSECE. So we thought that it would be useful to dig a little bit into this question and hopefully give you all some ideas of what is feasible. As with many complex things, the answer, of course, is it depends what geographic analyses are possible with the NSECE data. It depends on things like, do the data exist at all? So obviously this was a sample survey. We did not collect data from every jurisdiction and every provider in every household, and in some cases we just don't even have data about a particular location, for example. Or we may not have variables of interest to you. Then the second question is probably the thorniest and the most subject to change from topic to topic, research question to research question, and that is, are the data adequate? And by this we mean how large are the sample sizes for the types of analyses you're thinking about? What are your precision requirements when you think about whether or not you want to undertake some analyses with the NSECE data? How accurate does your answer need to be, whether in terms of confidence intervals or standard errors? And then, what is the underlying variation in the data that you would be exploiting to make your estimates? These are all questions that vary a great deal from topic to topic and are likely to be the hardest for any given researcher to really understand at the start of a research project. In addition, many of these data are restricted use in a variety of ways to protect the identities of our participants. And so there may be special kinds of permissions. In some cases, there may be some cost implications, although in general, the NSECE, the public use data are all free and widely available. But there may be permissions, resources, other requirements for doing certain types of analyses. And then finally, there are quite strict disclosure restrictions for certain types of data, again, to protect the identities of our participants. And those may affect the types of analyses you can do or how you would undertake an analysis. So our plan is to spend the next hour plus really trying to answer this question, what analyses are possible, by going through a variety of scenarios and examples. To do this, we will talk about the levels of geography that are most relevant to the NSECE design. We especially want to emphasize that levels of geography can enter into the sampling process, how you undertake analyses, what types of linkages you could do as part of your analyses, and then finally how you report the data And in fact, how geography enters in can vary across these different phases of work. We are delighted to have a research team join us as presenters today to talk through a specific example of work that they have done that exploits different levels of geography and data linkages. And then finally, we'll review some of the resources that are available for you. So we'll do a quick overview of the design. Then we'll talk, as I mentioned, about how geography enters into the sampling design, what geographic elements might be available for data analyses, how geography can contribute to linkages of NSECE data to other data sources. We'll mention a little bit about other geography-related constructs that could pertain especially to analyses. And then finally, how do we think about reporting NSECE estimates in terms of different kinds of geography. And as I mentioned, Julia Delat and Heather Sandstrom are joining us today to talk through an example that they have undertaken that uses multiple levels and geographic elements to exploit the NSECE design and answer an important policy question. And then we'll try to bring it all home so that you feel equipped to answer that question: what types of geographic analyses are feasible to do in the NSECE? Just to remind us, the 2012 National Survey of Early Care and Education was sponsored by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation in the Administration for Children and Families, which is a DHHS agency. Our federal project officer is Ivelisse Martinez-Beck, and we also work with Ann Rivera at OPRE. I am Rupa Datta. As I said, I was the project director. We had a very large and wonderfully talented team for the 2012 NSECE. Our scientific lead as principal investigator was Bob Gurga. We also had co-principal investigators and then a variety of research teams who were deeply involved in the design as well as the preparation and analyses of the data. And we hope whenever you are using these data files, you are seeing the fruit of having a wide variety of expertise and substantive interests contribute to how we've tried to put these data together to facilitate research. So let's think a little bit about what we mean when we talk about using geography in analyses. So I'm going to go through 3 examples that really help elucidate how geography can vary in different ways at different levels. So consider the question, what is the average listed price for infant care? And does that listed price vary between low and high income communities? So in this case, we're using the entire national sample of data. It's a nationally representative sample. And so that is important, that it is a nationally representative sample. But in other ways, the geography of the sampling approach is not necessarily important. At the analysis level, we're again using the national data. What we're also exploiting is that in the data file, we have community characteristics variables that used the actual address of each provider, as well as American Community Survey data from the Census Bureau to characterize the community in which that provider was located. So we've taken highly restricted, very confidential data, we've linked it already to census data for you, but what you have in the data file is just a variable that says this is a high, medium, or low poverty community. So you are able to do a geographically based analysis in which you're distinguishing geographies with high and low incomes, but you can do so using the full data file. You personally are not going to need to do any linkages in that case because the research team did it for you by bringing in these census data. And then because all of this is possible with the public use data, there are no reporting restrictions at all. You can report the tabulations that you have completed in whatever way you'd like. So in this case, you can describe the high-income communities have an infant care price of whatever, and it is more or less than low-income communities. You've exploited geography, you've exploited linkages to the census data, but in your case, it's a quite straightforward analysis using public use data. On the other hand, here's a slightly different framing. What's the average listed price for infant care? And does that listed price vary across states? So now, instead of a geographic element that's about the very small community surrounding a provider and its poverty density, now we're saying what is the average price in each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia. So we actually have data in all states, and we're talking about a tabulation in which you would take all of the data in Kentucky, say, and generate a Kentucky average listed price for infant care and a different one for Florida. So although we have data in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, the sample sizes do vary significantly across the states, roughly in proportion to how big the state's overall population is. And so what you will find is that there are states, like California and Texas and Florida, where for sure you can generate a state-level estimate. And then there are states with very small sample sizes, in this case for center-based providers. And so you may not be able to generate an estimate for infant care in centers in Idaho, because Idaho is a state with a very small population. Not only are there sample size restrictions, but we also have disclosure requirements that you must meet in order to safely report an estimate. So, for example, if there are 3 centers in a state, you might be able to calculate a mean, but you would not be permitted, according to the disclosure guidelines, you couldn't report the average of those 3 cases in a publicly available document. And so here, the question of what is feasible enters in a multiple different ways. There's the sampling question of how many states even have enough cases to generate an estimate. You may, from an analytic perspective, have precision requirements. You may not want your standard error to exceed the mean by more than a third or something like that. And then there are disclosure restrictions, so that even if you are happy with an estimate, the NSECE guidelines for reporting data may not allow you to report an estimate of a certain level. And so this is an instance where there are quite a variety of different intervening factors. Certainly there are many states for which you can generate an estimate. Also certain is that you can't do so for 51 states. And so in between many and 51 is the magic answer, depending on your specific question. A third example now brings in linkages. So what is the average price, listed price for infant care, and does that listed price vary by state-level regulations on child-staff ratios? Okay, so this is a question that you can approach in a number of different ways. Potentially, you could use all 50 states and the District of Columbia's data to generate this estimate. You could conduct the analysis at a national level, for example, and run a regression that enters in regulations, so that you would have one regression with different estimates for different types of regulations. Or you might divide up groups of states by region, for example, or by the type of, the ratio that they had. Similarly, you could just do individual states and report them. What's the linkage here? Well, the linkage is that you're using the state identifier to bring in the ratios as specified in the licensing language. And so the national data don't include information on state level licensing requirements, but you can, using publicly available data on licensing, connect each case in the NSECE data files with the appropriate licensing requirement in its state. And so this is an example where you're faced with sample size constraints, as we had in the prior example. You'll have whatever variation in terms of your state level regulations. And then there's the question of how you want to undertake your analysis and reporting that maximizes whatever your objectives. And you could imagine a variety of different ways to balance what the disclosure requirements allow you to report against the nature of your research question, against the particular alternatives maybe that you're trying to evaluate. So hopefully these examples are getting you to start thinking about, okay, here's the sampling piece, and here are my analytic choices, and how would I want to do this linkage, and then what will be the constraints when I report my analyses. Just briefly, the sample design, the 2012 NSECE included 4 questionnaires. Many of you probably already know all of this. There was a household survey with children under age 13, home-based provider survey of providers regularly providing early care and education to children under 13, center-based providers serving children not yet in kindergarten, and classroom-assigned staff in those centers. It's important to think about, for today's topic, that the sample sizes of these different surveys varied quite a lot. So there are 11,600 households and 5,600 center-based classroom-assigned staff. So the sample sizes varied quite a bit, and other disclosure risks also vary across these surveys. And so the concepts that we'll be talking about apply to all 4 surveys, but the specifics of how many cases you can report, or how much variation there is, or what types of analyses are feasible will vary from survey to survey, and of course from research question to research question. As I've mentioned, the data were collected nationally in each of the 50 states as well as the District of Columbia. We had a place-based dimension to the design, and so households and providers were selected from the same local areas, and there was an oversample of low-income communities. The way in which we overlapped the households and providers is something that we call the NSECE provider cluster. So this is an example, a hypothetical example of how this would work. What you see in the yellow there is the anchor tract. This is a census tract that would have been selected and from which households would have been sampled for the study. We then identify the population centroid of that central census tract. That's the little blue star there. And then we draw a circle of radius 2 miles around the population centroid. And then we take every census tract that overlaps in any way with that blue circle. And so we call these grayed out census tracts scatter tracts. And so they scatter around the central yellow household tract. And we sampled providers throughout the gray and yellow areas so that you can see that the households are central and the providers fill the area around those households. And so whether the household draws care from that provider cluster or not, the premise is that the supply of providers within that gray area is influencing the household's choices, even if the household ultimately decides to go elsewhere for care. And so the entire sample is made up of these provider clusters throughout the country. Altogether, we have 50 states plus DC. There were a second layer of sampling of counties and county clusters. There are 219 total counties or county clusters across our national sample, with at least 2 such clusters in each state. And then there were 755 provider clusters, that's the map I just showed you, with at least 2 low-income and 1 non-low-income cluster per county or county cluster. So how do we put this all together? NSECE data can be analyzed in a variety of different levels. We can have national analyses. As I described earlier on, we have community characteristics that allow you to aggregate across the country based on some kind of community characteristic. Like, I want to know about nationally areas with high poverty density. What can you tell me about households living in areas with high poverty density? And we can generate an estimate in that kind of geography. A simpler one to think about might be rural areas, for example. Then we have state-level analyses. And then it's also possible to do county or county cluster as well as provider cluster level analyses. These then, it gets trickier because of sample sizes, because of disclosure protections. Even the methods to access the data are more complex at these finer levels of geography, but they are indeed feasible given the data files that OPRE has made available to researchers. The provider cluster, which is the map that I showed you, is particularly relevant if you want to link households in the household survey to providers in the different provider surveys. And so the most common use of the provider cluster would be to link the different components of the NSECE together to do different sort of supply and demand types of analyses. The community characteristics, I think you've probably understood by now, are exploiting the cluster design, although in this case, for a provider community characteristic, we may be centering now on the provider's location and describing the area around the provider, not necessarily the area around a household. So for every element of the NSECE data files, we're able to describe the immediate community, always using American Community Survey data and always using this particular mapping strategy. But the neighborhoods around providers may not be quite the same as the neighborhoods around households. And so when we think about linkages, I talked about the potential for linking households to providers, but the other type of linkage we might be thinking about are linking NSECE data to non-NSECE data. And that would be, for example, at the state level, as we discussed, linking, for example, licensing standards. It's also possible to bring in county-level data. The county-level data, for example, in a state where child care policies or subsidy reimbursement rates vary at the county level, one could link policies to the county level, although the analysis then probably needs to be done at a different level because for any given county, both the sample sizes will be small and disclosure restrictions will generally prevent discussion of the county level. Similarly, one can do address level linkages. The most obvious example of this are these community characteristics where we've used the actual address to link to local census data, but it's possible to link to transportation resources and geographic features and various other things at the address level. Because of disclosure restrictions, the ways in which these different types of data are accessed vary, and in some cases, for example, at the address level and usually at the county level, it may be that what needs to happen is that a given research team could commission the NSECE project team to create variables or prepare a data file that would allow the research team to exploit the data without actually seeing the identifiers that would compromise confidentiality. Carolina Malesi is on the phone and is my colleague here at NORC. And Carolina, maybe I will turn over to you for a little bit.
Okay. I think we will cover the access to geographic level information at the end of the webinar. Is there any questions? So I will move the slides a little bit to get to the reporting guidelines, which is what I'd like to discuss now. So as Rupa mentioned, there are different reporting guidelines for the NSECE files, and the main purpose of the various reporting guidelines is to maintain the privacy and confidentiality of the respondents to the various NSECE surveys. So before we get into kind of the specific guidelines, I'd like to discuss kind of why do we care about disclosure. One of the reasons is that the IRB and the Certificate of Confidentiality require NORC and OPRE to protect the identity and data of all respondents who participated in the NSECE. So as a key responsibility we have as stewards of the NSECE data is to protect the identity of everyone who participated in the surveys. This includes the identity of providers and the identity of teachers and caregivers working in those home-based settings or center-based settings. This, as the slide mentions, the disclosure protections includes protecting against disclosures to third parties, such as, the audience that you may have in a research conference or someone who reads a brief about the NSECE, but also against respondents identifying themselves or others in the data. So we always have to put ourselves in the scenario of someone trying to identify themselves, and by doing that, they could identify other providers in the same provider cluster, for instance. If disclosure were to be violated, there would be damages to respondent trust of NORC, and OPRE, and any other future NSECE data collections, and Rupa will come back to that at the end of today's presentation. Since this is a geography-related webinar, I want to make sure that you understand that one of the key ways for providers or teachers and caregivers to be identified is through their location. So you may not know necessarily that, a particular center-based provider named X is part of the data, but if you know where they're located, you may be able to identify them. And that's why there's so much protection around data regarding the geographic information in the NSECE. The disclosure risk varies across the NSECE files, and Rupa alluded to this. The disclosure risk of the center-based provider file is the greatest. And this is the greatest because the sampling frame is constructed from publicly available administrative lists, and there is a high sampling rate, meaning that there's a relatively small sampling frame, and we sample about 8 out of 100 centers in those publicly available lists. And many attributes of these center-based providers are available in public use data files, such as, for instance, whether they receive any revenue from public funding. So that's why, because the disclosure risk is highest for this file, the reporting guidelines are the strictest for this file as well. So as the slide mentions, even though the disclosure risks of the household-based file and the home-based provider file are lower than centers, linkages between providers and households need to be carefully considered. So whenever you are doing a supply and demand analysis that combines households and providers, we pay particular attention to disclosure risk, and I think Heather and Julia will refer to this in their example. One of the main ways, one of the key strategies that the NSECE has used to reduce disclosure risk is through the suppression and reduction of geographic level information. So the first way is that we have simply suppressed some geographic information in the data file. So for instance, in the public use files and the restricted level 1 files, there is no information on distance from household to work, and there is no identification of the state in either the public use file or the restricted use level 1 files. And there is no, even in the restricted use level 2 files, there is no identification of sub-state units such as counties. So that's one way in which kind of their more detailed geographic information is available in the most restrictive used files. The other way in which we have minimized disclosure is to reduce the level of detail in the geographic level variable. So for instance, in the distance between household and providers in the public use file is presented as a categorical variable, and in the restricted use files is presented as a continuous version. So in the restricted use files, you will have the actual number of miles that it takes from families to travel from their household to the provider, but in the public use file, you will only know 3 or 4 categories. Another way in which we have reduced the geographic level information is through the use of simulated cluster IDs or fake cluster IDs in the level 2 files. So we would actually do the linkage between households and providers, and we would use a simulated cluster. You will create a syntax, and we will run that syntax for you, generating the cluster level aggregates, because we only know what the real IDs are. So in the final slide in this section, I want to refer to some of the ways in which we have tried to minimize disclosure risk. And this only applies to restricted use files. So the public use files and what we have been calling the quick tabulation files, which is a simpler version of the public use file ready for analysis, those files can be downloaded from the ICPSR website. What I'm talking about here only applies to restricted use files. And the 3 basic criteria in the reporting guidelines are suppression, rounding, and significant digits. So suppression means that there are some cells that you actually do not show publicly. You may know that a cell was very small, such as, let's say, 9 unweighted cases in the case of a household survey, and you are not allowed to report any estimate that uses such a small number of cases, either a regression, a mean, a proportion, or any other weighted frequency. Rounding refers to the rounding of unweighted counts and weighted estimates, And the number of significant digits is a rule that we implemented so that regardless of the scale in which you choose to report your estimates, there is a limit to the level of detail and the level of information that you can reveal. And because the disclosure risk varies across files, the thresholds used for suppression and rounding vary across files. So there are detailed disclosure guidelines for restricted level 1 files and detailed disclosure guidelines for level 2 files, and those vary, as I mentioned before, they're strictest for CB, and but they also vary across the other NSECE data files. So with that, I will turn it over to Julia and Heather for us to kind of get a chance to see how this actual geographic level information varies at the different stages of the product in a real-life example.
Thanks, Carolina. This is Julia Gillette, and I'm going to talk about a project that Heather Sandstrom and I did together. That we were looking at child care choices in immigrant families, and I'll just talk through the different geographies that we used in our analysis. So this is a project that we did with funding from the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation in the Administration for Children and Families. We're grateful for that. And we had a number of research questions, but the relevant ones for today were first looking at child care settings that immigrant families use and how those child care settings differ from those used by U.S.-born households. And then we were interested in what factors were associated with using center-based care, whether it's family preferences, demographics, employment characteristics, community characteristics, or the local supply of center-based child care. And then we were also interested in looking at a child care subsidy receipt and take-up, so looking at what state or local subsidy policies are associated with higher uptake of subsidy and greater use of center-based care. We used quite a number of data sources that we pulled together to look at this. We were doing our analysis at the national level, but we wanted to merge in some local characteristics. So our main data source was the NSECE household survey, and we were using the level 2 restricted access data file. We also pulled in data from the household survey that came in the calendar file. We pulled in data from the center-based provider survey. We pulled in some state and county subsidy policies based on the CCDF policies database. We pulled in additional data from the American Community Survey, and we also tried adding in some other measures of state context for immigrants, state policies towards immigrants that some colleagues and I had pulled together for a different project. And our sample was all households with a child under age 5. So we weren't using the whole sample, but we had a fairly large sample to work with. So we tried looking at measures from 4 different levels. Ultimately, we ended up using measures at the family, cluster, and state level, but we also explored the possibility of using county-level measures. And I'm just going to talk through each level, starting from the smallest to the biggest. So like I said, the household data file was our main data source. From that, there's a wealth of information in there, so we were able to pull in family demographic characteristics, measures of socioeconomic status, parental employment characteristics, and also parents' child care preferences, how they rated different types of child care along various dimensions. And then we wanted to look at parents' weekly work hours, both to look at potential subsidy eligibility and also just to get a sense of how parents' work hours correlated with use of non-parental or center-based care. So to do that, we pulled in data from the calendar file that has measures of parent schedules or household member schedules in 15-minute increments. So it was pretty easy for us to code the number of work hours in the reference week for parents and then just merge that back into the household survey using the household ID. So those were the household level measures that we used. And then we also pulled in some measures at the cluster level. So first we used, as Rupa explained, there are some measures of the community context already available in the household survey from the American Community Survey. So we thought that the local demographics might shape families' use of non-parental or center-based care. depending on whether there were a lot of other immigrant or Latino families nearby or other low-income families nearby. So we used a number of measures that were already provided in the data set. And then we also wanted to merge in data from the Center-Based Provider Survey about the local availability of center-based care. So we were able to create some measures of the cluster-level characteristics of center-based providers, the total number of center-based slots, and then the characteristics of those slots, like the funding sources for the slots, the share of slots that were in centers that provide transportation, the share that were from providers with a quality rating, and things like that. So we weren't able to access the cluster-level IDs ourselves, as Carolina explained. Instead, we were given the center-based provider survey with pseudo-cluster IDs, so made-up cluster IDs attached. And then we wrote the Stata code to create the measures that we wanted to attach to the household survey. And then the NSECE team helped us. They attached the real cluster IDs, they reran our code, and created the real measures, and then attached it to the household-level data for us. In the process, there were some changes that were made in terms of, disclosure risk. There were some masking rules. So there were some clusters that had no center-based providers, so we were able to know that. And then there were some clusters that had a very small number of center-based providers. So in those clusters, we weren't able to merge on the information about those providers. We just had missing data attached to our household-level sample. And there were some measures that we ideally had hoped to have as continuous, like the overall number of center-based childcare slots in the cluster. But due to disclosure risk, we ended up having categorical measures that we were able to attach. So that worked out fine for our analysis in the end. So I think that the availability of being able to compare household-level demand, characteristics and preferences, and supply from the local child care markets at the cluster level is a real asset of the NSECE data, and it was really great for us to be able to do that. In terms of challenges, it just takes a little bit of extra time to work with the NSECE team, and since they have to do some of the work and everybody is busy, we are and they are, it just required building in some extra time for that process. And then, as I mentioned, there were some masking rules that we had to work around, so we weren't able to do everything that we ideally wanted to do. We had a really, really long list of measures that we initially wanted to attach, and we weren't able to attach all of them, but we were able to get to the heart of the analysis that we wanted to do. And then I think every project probably presents a new set of concerns or just things to think through logistically, so it's good to just expect that there will be some time for some back and forth to figure out kind of the logistics of working through a situation and what are the disclosure risks and how can they be mitigated. Okay, so next we also wanted to merge on some county level information because we were interested in child care subsidy policies. In some states there are county run programs, so we wanted to merge on the county level policies. And we had a number of policies that we wanted to look at. This ended up being difficult for us. On the one hand, there is this sub-state information available, and that's really wonderful for a lot of different research opportunities, and we appreciate the NSECE team's willingness to work with us on this. Ultimately, as Rupa mentioned, there are some individual counties that are available in the data, and there are some county clusters, and so we were kind of going back and forth trying to figure out where our sample was, especially our foreign-born sample, which counties or county clusters they were in, to try to figure out which county policies we should find, and it was really time-consuming to dig up the county-level policies, and we weren't able to see exactly which counties our sample was in, and so it just became kind of a bigger burden than our resources could handle to do this work, and so we realized that it wasn't really worth trying to merge on the county policies. We would just use the state policies for the most populous county in the state, which is what the CCDF policies database does. So I think it's a great opportunity to have that sub-state information. Ultimately, it didn't work for us. And then because we also wanted to merge on the provider cluster level information, it was also creating a disclosure risk for us because we had the state IDs and then we started to have some county IDs, and then we were going to add cluster level information. So it was easiest for us to just take out all of the county level information, and that mitigated some disclosure concerns. And then finally, we added on some state level measures. So we added on the CCDF policies database of child care subsidy policies at the state level. And we also added some extra information related to the state context for immigrant families. So some state data from the American Community Survey at the state level about rates of public benefits take-up among mixed-status immigrant households. And then I had created for another project a coding of state policies towards immigrants that we were able to merge on too. And this was very straightforward because we had the level 2 data. We had the state IDs already in our household level data. So we simply created some spreadsheets of the measures that we wanted to attach at the state level, and then sent those to the NSECE team. They uploaded them into our secure space, and then we were able to do the merge ourselves and do the analysis. So this was really easy for us to add on the state level information. We could try lots of different things to look at different state level contextual measures. The only challenge is there's just a short delay for the process of uploading the files. And then, as I said before, we were just interested in outcomes at the national level. So we weren't trying to report on any state level characteristics or findings. So as Rupa and Carlina mentioned, there may be different disclosure rules if you're trying to look at individual states. If you have any questions, we're happy to answer them now if you want to type them in, or feel free to contact us afterwards as well.
So just to wrap up, we have tried to point out that geography in NSECE analyses really enters in at various stages. There is the way in which geography affected the sample, and that, at this point, is a done deal. We, the design, what it was, we have cases where they exist, and so researchers have to work with the sample sizes that are achieved, the hierarchies that we have, things like that. The next level, though, are how a researcher wants to specify his or her analyses, and there's quite a bit of flexibility in that level. And just as Julia just demonstrated, you can think about analyses at a variety of different levels, and this helps formulate questions in different ways and deal with both some of the sample limitations as well as some of the disclosure restrictions. Similarly, linkages can also happen at different levels depending on the data sources you have, the amount of effort that you want to implement in the linkage activity, and of course your research questions. And then the final element is how the estimates can be reported, which really are all about disclosure protection. And in that case, the requirements for disclosure protection are extremely strict. However, there are a variety of ways through the analysis and through the reporting that you can choose to comply with the disclosure requirements. The NSECE team really is only concerned with ensuring that the disclosure requirements are met, but if researchers are interested, we can try to help brainstorm different techniques for achieving the research that you want within the limitations of the disclosure requirements. So, coming back to our original motivating question, are state-level analyses possible? So, what types of things are we talking about when we talk about state-level analyses? So we could be talking about, I want to do an in-depth analysis of my state. So that would be a research question along the lines of, among workers in state Y, did this happen or that happen, or what are their characteristics? And depending on, obviously, the data file and the characteristics you're interested in, generally these types of analyses may only be feasible in the largest states. There's no, you can try it in any state, but between the disclosure requirements and the sample sizes, in most smaller states, the focusing on a single state will turn out to be not very fruitful. The next type of state-level analysis that one could think about would be kind of high-level state comparisons. So X% of states have centers that receive public funding, or Y% of states have home-based providers, the majority of home-based providers serve 5 or more children, things like that. In this case, the requirements for how many cases you have in any given state are much less than when you're trying to do in-depth analyses, as in the first example. And we have seen research teams that have been able to generate state-specific estimates for up to 30 states. The NSECE team ourselves has also generated some estimates that included up to 30 states. So there much more is feasible if you're really interested in estimating one parameter each in a variety of states and aren't cutting the data in very, very fine packages. And then the final way is much more along the lines of what Julia talked about, which is the incorporation of state characteristics. So that would be a statement, a research study that ended with statements like, in states that require licensing for subsidies, X, Y, or Z happens. And in that case, all 50 states and the DC cases can all be deployed in the analysis. In general, in the restricted use environments, what we try to work with researchers on is you can upload and use almost anything in your analysis if it's well documented and we can understand the risk. But what will happen is that the disclosure requirements are inflexible and very strictly imposed. So you can explore the data, you can include really, really fine and nuanced state characteristics in your analysis, but ultimately when you report, you need to be able to reassure the team that there is no inadvertent disclosure of locations. But incorporation of state characteristics in general is quite unconstrained, and Julia mentioned that they were able to do a variety of things at that point. So we wanted to note that OPRE has begun work on a 2019 National Survey of Early Care and Education, and that fielding will include the supply side only, so listed home-based. We haven't really talked about what listed and unlisted mean in this webinar, but the listed home-based are the home-based that can be identified off of state and national lists. The center-based providers and the center-based classroom-assigned workers, those three components, all of which flesh out the supply side, will be included in a 2019 NSECE. At present, we expect that sample sizes for those three groups will be roughly similar to what they were in 2012. And so whatever is feasible in terms of state-specific analyses in 2012 data will likely also be feasible in terms of 2019 data. However, OPRE is making available the option that states or maybe foundations could provide funds to supplement sample sizes in a specific location. So a state could choose to add, 100 cases, 100 centers to its NSECE sample. And by doing so, that could fundamentally alter the types of analyses that are feasible for that state in the 2019 data. We did have some state supplementation in the 2012 data, but that was in larger states that had specific subpopulations that they were interested in, but the same device could be used for states that are currently not quite having large enough samples to support analyses in the 2012 data, but with some small supplementation could be more robust analytic samples. And that possibility is available for 2019. Anyone who was interested would be welcome to contact the NSECE team at NORC if you'd like to know more about that. I think that we are done. I will remind, as we always do, that ICPSR Research Connections maintains an invaluable NSECE resource page, and that includes data files, tabulations, some tutorials, the webinar will be recorded and stored there, the instruments. We really encourage people to visit the site to learn more about the data and to explore other ways in which it might be useful in your research. We love to hear from NSECE users. The email address is nsec@norc.org. We welcome questions about the data, as well as about the 2012 data, as well as about possibilities for 2019. I think that is our to-do list for the day. Brian, do we have any questions?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing the fruits of the webinar in researchers' work in the coming months. And we're always eager to hear what else people might like to learn about. Thank you for joining us today.